All right, so you are here for the Teen Driving Safety Recent Research and Implementations for Prevention webinar. We have two really amazing speakers who will be presenting this webinar. I'm really excited to see their presentation. I hope you are too. We are going to, first, just so everybody knows, Children's Safety Network is sponsoring this webinar. And I happen to be a member of the CSN Alliance, which is a multidisciplinary, across the country group of folks with common interest here. And I've been participating in that for a while, and I love it. So thank you for being here. I hope some of you are also involved in that work. As we know, motor vehicle accidents is a big issue with the work we do with kids and young people, so this should be a really great opportunity for all of us. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Sally Thigpen, as I mentioned. I do work at the CDC, and I work on injury and violence in the Injury Center, and I'm a program evaluator there. So I probably know many of you. I hope I know many of you, and I am so glad you're here. Before we hop into the actual webinar and you get to know your first speaker, I think we'll bring Kate back in because she knows all the stuff I don't know about, this technical stuff. So we'll bring Kate back in.
Great. Thank you so much, Sally. So if you can hear me right now, you will know that the audio is being broadcast through your computer speakers. The quality of the audio depends on your internet. If you're having issues hearing us, you can dial in at the phone number on the screen. It's also in the audio notes right above our Q&A pod. You are muted because there is quite a lot of you right now, so you can ask your questions through that Q&A pod at any time. Today's slides are available in that top left pod where it says download today's slides. Again, you can use that Q&A pod at the bottom left to ask questions at any time. And this session is being recorded and will be published on CSN's website within a week. All right, Sally, so I'm going to take us quick to our HRSA logo, and then we'll go to you.
Great, thanks. So this is the standard disclaimer that you've seen probably many times when you're on a federally funded webinar. I think that the most important thing to make clear during this, on this slide, is that we as CDC or HRSA, HHS, any U.S. government agency, we do not, this is not our content, and the conclusions of this, the authors that you will be hearing from do not represent the CDC or any other federal agency. I think that's really the take-home message here. And let me go ahead and introduce you to our two speakers. I'm going to introduce each speaker before they speak, so I'll introduce our second speaker right before he speaks. But the speakers for today are Dr. Barbara Banz, PhD, and Dr. Federico Vaca, MD, MPH. We're going to start our webinar with Dr. Banz. Dr. Banz is a cognitive neuroscientist with expertise in youth alcohol use and assistant professor of emergency medicine, where she serves as core facility in the Yale Developmental Neurocognitive Driving Simulation Research Center, or DriveSim Lab, that's easier to say. Her ongoing research is aimed to develop a profile of how alcohol and drug use during youth translates to neurocognitive functioning and real-world implications for young drivers. Dr. Banz designs and builds high-fidelity driving simulation studies in order to bridge cognitive neuroscience with real-world application, working to understand the brain to save the lives of teens and young adults so that they can thrive in early adulthood and beyond. So with that, we are going to go ahead and hear from Dr. Banz. So welcome, Dr. Banz.
Thank you for the introduction, Sally. I'm Dr. Barbara Banz, and I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to speak to such a broad and diverse audience about the neuroscience of driving and the unique complexities of teen driving. As many of us may know and recognize, for adolescents, earning a driver's license is a major milestone in the pathway towards gaining independence. And while this is directly linked to overall greater well-being across the lifespan, motor vehicle crashes are actually the leading cause of death for our teens and our young adults. And in fact, it's the first year of driving that's most dangerous, because in the first year of driving, we see that the fatal motor vehicle crash rates are actually 4.5 times as likely compared to any other age demographic. And while this high rate of fatal motor vehicle crashes is enough to cause public health concern, motor vehicle crashes, which result in injuries but not fatalities, actually outnumber those fatal motor vehicle crashes about 100 to 1. And it's frequently these non-fatal injuries that are accompanied by high financial burdens due to emergency care, hospitalizations, and rehabilitation costs. And there are also substantial tangible and intangible physical and emotional disabilities that may persist and markedly reduce and diminish the quality of life, not only for the driver, but also for the individual in the crash, as well as their families and their support network. So one thing that we do understand, and anyone in the group today that has had a teenager or taught someone how to drive may understand that teen drivers are a unique population. And there are certain things that are inherent to young teen drivers and novice drivers that result in this, in the overrepresentation in motor vehicle crashes. And one thing that's probably very easy for all of us to understand is their general inexperience and lack of practice behind the wheel of a car. And because they have this lack of practice, we know that they may not understand some of the unspoken rules of the road. So many of us, as we drive in different regions, get used to the way people drive in a certain region, and young drivers don't have the experience within their region or within other areas to be able to really navigate the driving environment outside of their vehicle as a whole and engage with this behavior with other drivers. We also know that this lack of experience translates to not being able to fully be able to navigate dangerous driving environments. So every day our team may get on the road and drive to school or drive to work. They may drive curvy roads during the daytime when it's dry. But then all of a sudden they're driving at night and there's some rain or maybe some ice on the road, and they know in their mind that they need to reduce their speed, but because they don't have the experience, they may not be able to know exactly by how much they need to reduce their speed, and therefore putting them at risk for a motor vehicle crash. We also know that our teen drivers have a general poor vehicle control, so they're not able to drive a car quite as smoothly as more practiced drivers are. This tends to result in overcorrections. In steering. So if they start to swerve out of the road, they may overcorrect and turn the steering wheel very hard to get back onto the road or through intersections or to get around other vehicles. We also know that they tend to tailgate as well. So they're putting themselves at risk to be in motor vehicle crashes because they aren't navigating and they don't have the skill set yet to be able to navigate the roadway safely. And one other thing that we know is very frequent among and why we see an overrepresentation in motor vehicle crash fatalities for our teen drivers is that there's a reduced rate of wearing seatbelts for this young population, meaning that when they do get into a car accident, there's nothing restraining them and protecting them from the surrounding environment. So while all those things are pretty understandable for our teen drivers, they may also be applied to first-year drivers that aren't teens. So for our teens, there's some pretty unique complications. And one thing that we do know and understand well is that driving is a highly complex behavior, and it's completely reliant on the coordination of motor skills as well as underlying cognitive faculties. Unfortunately for our teen drivers, and what makes teen driving so unique is that the brain is not fully developed yet. And what I mean by this is that there's certain regions of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is still developing until the mid-20s. And so the prefrontal cortex is typically thought and associated with these cognitive faculties, specifically working memory, response inhibition, and attention, which are all directly and intimately tied to specific driving behaviors and the ability to reach our goal destination safely. Unfortunately, since the prefrontal cortex is still developing, so are these cognitive skills. And there are these naturally occurring imbalances going on at this time that if we think about our teens that we know in our lives, we can probably create a very stereotypical idea of the poor attention, poor planning, poor control. All of that translates to the driving world, meaning that our teen drivers are being asked to learn this highly complex behavior at a time when the underlying cognitive faculties and necessary skill sets aren't actually fully developed. And this behavior, while in the long term is something that's going to lead to their overall greater well-being, in this situation, if it's not carried out successfully, does have real life or death implications for the teen as well as their passengers and other people on the roadways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these three primary facets that are directly tied to driving behaviors. So response inhibition is something that we talk about in the cognitive realm as a way, our natural ability to stop a dominant response. And as drivers, we likely all have experienced this before, because as we're driving down the road and toward an intersection, we may see that the stoplight ahead of us is red. And as we start seeing that and we get a little bit closer, you can probably imagine yourself lifting your foot off of your accelerator, moving it over to the brake, and start pressing down on the brake pedal. However, all of a sudden, as you're driving towards it, the red light switches from red to green. So now we need to stop this dominant behavior, stop moving our foot over to the brake pedal, keep it on the accelerator, or move it back over to the accelerator in order to continue onto the road and have a safe travel. What we do know in simulated driving studies that those individuals, teens and young adults, as well as older adults that have poor response inhibition skills relates to overall greater speeds, churning with oncoming traffic close by, more motor vehicle crashes in a simulated setting, and a slower response time to hazards. So this all translates over to our real-world driving behaviors as well. So those folks who have poor response inhibitory skills tend to have more traffic violations related to speeding, related to swerving, and poor abilities to maintain their position in a roadway, as well as having riskier behaviors with peers and passengers in the car. Another facet that we talk about is working memory, and many of us have probably heard about and talked about short-term memory and long-term memory, but working memory kind of exists in its own little world, and this is our ability to hold and manipulate information in order to be able to achieve a goal. And in driving, that can be very easily thought of as I'm trying to drive home from work and I know that I need to make this upcoming right-hand turn. So I have that information and it's moving along and I keep tapping into it as I drive down the road and switch lanes. But now all of a sudden I'm in the right-hand lane, I have to make a right-hand turn ahead, and there's a bicyclist to the side of me. As I'm going along, before I make that right-hand turn, I'm now not only monitoring and manipulating the information that I have to make this right-hand turn, so I have to slow down, I have to put on my blinker and do all those things, but I also have to monitor that there's a bicyclist to the right of me. And I need to make sure that I'm switching my attention, I'm switching my brain from monitoring where this bicyclist is in order to be able to navigate the roadway, the turn safely, not only for me, but also to not interfere with the bicyclist. And just as we saw and know with response inhibition, the same thing translates over to simulated studies. So we see poor abilities to drive and have vehicle control for those young people with poor working memory skills. And again, we see this translates over to real-world driving behaviors where they report riskier driving profiles related to vehicle control for those that test with poor working memory skills. Now, attention may not be something that we need to talk about a lot in detail because there's a big public health concern surrounding distracted driving. In the cognitive world, we talk about this as our ability to focus on the information, again, to achieve our goal. And you may know this, that distracted driving, we talk a lot about texting and driving, eyes on the road, but attention is a multimodal facet, and driving is a multimodal behavior. So a way that I like to talk about this is that if you're driving down the road and you're looking for a new house number or you're trying to parallel park, This is all motor skills and visual. So you're just trying to look for something or navigate your environment. But instead, a lot of us, probably most people in the room, can raise their hand and say that if I'm just trying to do that, I probably turned on the radio. So this is something that shows us that attention is needed, is highly needed for driving, and that there's only a certain amount of attention that we can dedicate, and that driving takes a lot of that up during our normal behaviors. And this is a huge concern that we know from public health-wise, from a public health standpoint, as we know that there are at least 9 deaths every single day and over 1,000 injuries every day related to distracted driving. And then one thing that's happening is in more recent years, our driving environment is actually getting more complex. And this isn't just because of more radio, more CDs, things like that. And it's not just because of phones, but the infotainment systems that are going into motor vehicles by car manufacturers in order to make driving easier. So by integrating navigation systems and entertainment systems, it's creating a more complex and more easily distracted driving environment for all drivers, but in particular our young drivers may have more difficulties in this environment. Another unique complication for our teen drivers is that there's ongoing psychosocial development. So during this time where we're starting to see a shift from parent and family and mature adult influence to our peers' influence. And as my colleague will talk about, and how graduate driver's licensure programs have focused on reducing peer influence in the car for young drivers, we know that in a simulated setting there are narrow visual scan patterns. And that means that our drivers aren't engaging and aren't recognizing their entire roadway. So there may be people on the side of the road or animals on the side of the road that our young drivers aren't seeing when there are peers in the car because they're only focusing on a small space directly in front of their vehicle. And they also report general risky driving behaviors in a simulated setting. And this is likely why we know that teens are more likely to end up in a fatal motor vehicle crash if there's a passenger within the vehicle. Also during this time, we, as many of us in the room may know, especially considering this is a children's safety platform, that this is the time when initial alcohol and cannabis use is initiated for our teens. And in the alcohol and marijuana substance use research, we know that alcohol and cannabis have direct effects and have immediate effects on the brain. So we all know don't drink and drive, and we tell our teens don't drink and drive. With legalization changes, don't be intoxicated, so don't smoke marijuana and get behind the wheel of a car. However, one thing that's coming to light is that these brain function changes and these cognitive differences outlast this intoxication. So days later, weeks later, there are effects on the brain from the alcohol and cannabis use that can change the brain and can change brain function and relate directly over to driving, because these substances typically affect our response inhibition skills, our working memory skills, and our attention skills. Our lab has specifically shown, and along with our colleagues at the University of Iowa, that even while sober, our young adults and older adult populations that report drinking have riskier driving behaviors compared to non-drinking populations. And with the legalization changes on the forefront for many states in the United States for cannabis, this is of extreme importance to understand how cannabis use in our teen drivers can affect their driving behaviors even while sober. Because as we see legalization for recreational cannabis spread throughout the United States, we know that our perceptions on marijuana use are changing as well. So we'll start seeing more teens and more prolific use of marijuana use, which could potentially translate over to driving as well. And one thing that we're starting to think of now for our young drivers in particular is something that we're in the middle of, and we've been in the middle of for the last 18 months, and it's COVID. So one thing that we've been seeing from the driving research literature is that our driving behaviors have changed. For a long period after the initial lockdown, there was less driving. There were less people on the road. And through this last year and a half, many people are driving less overall. And so our driving behaviors as well-practiced adults have gotten a little unpracticed. We're all a little rusty. There's a lot of reports of people having to learn how to re-navigate roads and parking and things like that. And so for those of us that have been driving for a long period of time, to have this lack of practice because we're not driving as much, we're seeing detrimental effects. So this can only likely translate over to our young teen drivers that don't have as much exposure that we all have already. Also, the roadways are increasingly risky with all this. So there are greater reports of risky driver, higher speed crashes, as well as increased rates in driving while intoxicated for not only alcohol and marijuana, but also other substances as well. In fact, speaking of alcohol and cannabis or marijuana use, this continues to remain a problem for our adolescents. So adolescence, this teenage period, is the time where we have the greatest exposure to alcohol and marijuana across the lifespan. And one thing that was thought was that during this time we would actually see a decrease of alcohol and marijuana use for our teens because of the lack of availability. However, the use has remained the same even though there's the perceived availability has decreased the most significantly as in our history. So it's actually challenging the way we've thought about that. And unfortunately, back to our idea that more parental exposure may be helpful to us, we're seeing that one major fallout of COVID-19 is actually that our teens are being exposed to alcohol for the first time by their parents. So we're now trying to figure out that there's this new environment for our teen drivers to have some negative influences within their lives. So our lab at Yale, the Yale Developmental Neurocognitive Driving Simulation Research Center, our goal is to use a multifaceted approach in order to better understand our teen drivers in order to keep them safe. So we bridge cognitive neuroscience as well with high-fidelity driving simulation and prevention intervention methods in order to develop profiles of our young drivers and hopefully further reduce the rates of teen driver motor vehicle crash-related injuries and fatalities by being able to inform our training methods and our training procedures for our teen drivers. So I forgot we were doing Q&A at the end. So I just want to thank you all. I hope we get some good questions today. This is a really rich field to work within, and I want to say thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all, and I look forward to talking with you in a little while. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banz. That was so interesting, and I'm comforted by the fact that I'm not the only one who forgot how to drive over the last year and a half, so that makes me feel better. So that was really a great presentation, and as Dr. Banz mentioned, we will do Q&A at the end. So after we hear from Dr. Vaca, who has an equally interesting presentation, we'll do a Q&A. So with all that said, let me do an introduction of our next speaker. Federico Vaca is Professor and Vice Chair of Emergency Medicine and Director of Yale Developmental Neurocognitive Driving Simulation Resource Center. Dr. Vaca is a practicing and board-certified emergency medicine physician and physician scientist. He previously served as a medical fellow for the U.S. Department of Transportation's National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Over the last 20 years, his research has focused on occupant safety, adolescent development, and behaviors that influence the risk of motor vehicle crash morbidity and mortality, as well as health disparities and injury and alcohol use disorders. Dr. Vaca serves on a standing committee of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Transportation Research Board, which focuses on road user measurement and evaluation and vehicle user education, training, and licensing. So I am, welcome Dr. Vaca. I'm happy that you're here, and without further ado, we will move to your presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Sally. It's really wonderful to be on this webinar. Thank you again for inviting us. And I'm going to jump right into this because hopefully what I'd like to do is give you an overview of a couple of recent publications that we've put out related to delaying driving licensure and how that applies to teens. And really in that, bolstering a case for GDL policies, and we'll talk quite a bit more about that. But the discussion at the end is, I think, is what I'm looking most forward to here at this point, because I know you all have some great questions. So let's jump into this. By way of just thank you is to my co-authors on this work, and thank you to the NIH for funding our work. And we've got some really nice work ongoing, as well as just completing some other work having to do with teen drivers and delayed driving licensure. So by way of background, we'll start off here. As most of you already know, the most recent numbers, 2019, just looking at licensure, there's over 228 million licensed drivers, and young drivers make up 12 million of those. That's 5.3% of all U.S. licensed drivers. Looking at a difference between 2010 to 2019, we went from 13 million to 12 million licensed drivers. There's a comparative decrease of about 7.3%. And U.S., the population across the U.S. in this age group has had some decrease, so the demographic pyramid has changed a bit, but still not enough to really account for such a continued drop in the number of young drivers. Now, this all really matters because transportation is so important to us in so many different ways at so many different levels, but most importantly, it's about the safety of our friends, families, communities on the roadways. And unfortunately, in 2019, there were over 36,096 people killed in crashes, and more than 10,000 of those were alcohol-related. That accounts for about 20 deaths per day, unfortunately, and 2.7 million injuries in these crashes. Unfortunately, young drivers made up about 7.8, almost 8% of all the drivers involved in fatal crashes. And when just focusing in and drilling down a little bit further to the young drivers and what they're up against is, unfortunately, once again, in 2019, 3,698 killed, that's young drivers killed in fatal crashes, or involved in fatal crashes, and 1,603 killed in those crashes, and several more, as Dr. Banz already mentioned, many, many more injured. 386 of those young drivers in fatal crashes that died were alcohol-related. That's 24% of all young drivers killed in 2019. And unfortunately, we'll see that, as Dr. Banz once again alluded to, the prevalence of exposure to alcohol and other things that might impair someone in driving, particularly alcohol here. 82% of those drivers killed that were alcohol-related had a high BAC, or blood alcohol of greater than or equal to 0.08. And unfortunately, in that setting, we know all too well that restraint use is just not really all that prevalent. Now, as we think about prevention, of course, we all full well know that GDL has done some great things. GDL, in its earliest stages in the Netherlands, 1987, here in the United States, being implemented in 1996, and we know that there's been a number of evaluation studies of GDL, certainly showing at least 20 to 40% decrease of fatal crashes. And restrictions in nighttime driving and passengers in the vehicle have been pivotal facets of safety that GDL certainly offers. What we want to know more about, and some more recent research has shown, is that some work shows that as far as GDL safety and its coverage across all youth groups, and particularly some of the more vulnerable youth groups, may not be equally apparent. And so there's a lot more work to be done in this area. And with that, we couple this consideration of delaying driving licensure. Now, delaying driving licensure, the CDC and other folks have reported in this area that young driver licensure, teen licensure, has continued to go down. We kind of mentioned that a little bit already. But it's not clear why this has been going on. Certain studies have pointed toward a number of things, one being that of social media. It's basically easier to connect with friends, don't really need to drive across town or drive somewhere to see a friend. And the research in that area is a little bit mixed, showing that. GDL mandates and supervised practice driving, we can certainly see if where parents has noted that if you're teaching anybody to drive, it's not that easy to get behind the wheel or actually next to someone else that's learning to drive to be with them so they get their supervised practice hours in driving. Economics are certainly a major consideration. Vehicle costs, maintenance, insurance, all those things come into play. And other demographic and social characteristics, race, ethnicity, and what goes along with that in the background, again, of economics, parent approval of licensure, what parents know and don't know about GDL, and parent availability is noted with when it comes to supervised practice driving. So with that, we consider from a DDL perspective, our team was really interested in trying to understand this a bit more. We recently published this article in the Journal of Adolescent Health, and our objective here was to assess the prevalence, differences, and disparities of factors associated with DDL, that is delayed driving licensure, among teens and young adults. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of background and just some overview of some of our findings in the study, and then we'll move to another study very quickly and then open it up, or close it out and open it up to questions. So we undertook this study using 7 waves of the Next Generation Health Study, which is a nationally representative cohort of U.S. 10th graders. This is they were 10th grade about 2009 to 2010 was year 1, and then 7 years forward, that's 4 years after leaving high school. We enrolled in high schools, nearly 3,000 cohorts. Members participated in the study, and there was oversampling of African Americans in order to get an accurate population estimate of our findings and many other findings. Now, this study was much broader than just about traffic safety. It had to do with a number of other things in youth health and well-being, but this is what I'm reporting on today, is this traffic safety component. We developed a delay in driving measure for this, and it was defined as any delay in licensure past the earliest time a participant is legally eligible for licensure. And there were 3 levels: no DDL, intermediate DDL, which started at least at a delay of 1 year to 2 years of delaying driving licensure, and then long DDL, that is delaying licensure more than 2 years. We looked at a number of other factors, of course: demographic, sex, urbanicity, race, ethnicity, family structure, parental education, family affluence, and a number of other things. I'd encourage you to look at the paper. There are many other details that I think you may find interesting in there. Our analysis was straightforward. Of course, some multinomial logistic regressions and controlling for a number of factors here, and I'm just going to go over some of the main findings here. In our sample, we had 2,525 eligible for licensure over the 7-year interview time period. If you look here on the slide, you'll see that in our sample, it was nearly about 70% of the youth that actually delayed at least 1 year or more. Now, when we look at the differences between the racial and ethnic groups and the disparities here, we see that Latino youth had 2.5 to 4.5 times greater odds of intermediate and long delay. Non-Latino Black youth, 2.3 times greater odds of long DDL. Those living with a single parent or in a single parent family had 1.7 times greater odds of long delay. And those with parents' highest level of education being less than high school and or those with some college had 3.7 to 2 times greater odds of long DDL. Youth reporting low family affluence had a 2.5 and a 4.4 times greater odds of intermediate and long delay of licensure, respectively. And urban and suburban youth had 1.9 and 3.5 times greater odds of long DDL. Here, in the opposite direction, what we did see was a high mother's parental monitoring knowledge had a lower odds of long DDL, and while we speculate a bit here, we do believe that at least what we like to say is that moms have a good finger on the pulse when it comes to developmental readiness of their teen ready for driving, and maybe that played into this somewhat. But again, it's a little speculative and more work needs to be done there. Like any other study, this study had some limitations. We did not have the exact date of when the participant was licensed. However, we did have their birth date. We knew what state they were living in. Year by year, we asked them if they had a driver's permit or their license. So we have a pretty good estimate of when they did get licensed. This enrollment in this study was school-based, and so that really limits our generalization. That is that, unfortunately, for some of the most risky teens, they're not going to be in school, so we really can't say too much about that population of youth. Participants self-reported parental monitoring knowledge, and finally, the family affluence that we use to measure is a validated measure used in international studies and national studies. It's really not to be equated with household income. However, it is quite valuable because it does note to money that the family has, the number of vehicles, if the youth has their own room at home, number of computers, number of recent vacations in the last year. So you get an understanding of the expendable income that the family might have. So it's a nice measure, but it still is not exactly household income. So some of the implications and findings and a couple of questions here to be posed as a result of the outcomes of the study. We did identify that Latino and non-Latino Black teens are much more likely to DDL. There are certainly socioeconomic and parenting factors contributing to DDL. And two questions here that they're out to be yet fully understood is, could those that DDL miss out on driver safety and crash prevention benefits of GDL in a meaningful way? We're not sure. We believe there might be some missing out there that does happen, but more work needs to be done. Secondly, could extending GDL broaden the base of GDL demonstrated safety benefits for young drivers who would otherwise DDL? Currently in the United States, there are 6 states in D.C., I believe, that have some level of extended GDL, with Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, Minneapolis, Indiana, and New Jersey. But they're quite different than what we see at extended GDL for all novice drivers in different parts of the world, like the UK or Australia, that have shown some benefits there from a crash reduction perspective. So just a couple of slides here on this other study that I'll transition to that is also tied. It gives us a little more detail of delaying driving licensure. This also was a study that was recently published in the Journal of Traffic Injury Prevention. And here, what we wanted to get at was to explore time to licensure associated with teens, race, ethnicity, and GDL restrictions. And we took a survival analysis approach. It's just kind of a statistical and analytical method that we can look at time to a particular event. In this situation, the event was actual licensure. And the next slide that I put up here, we see this graphic. This are the survival curves for time to licensure among Latino, African Americans, and white youth in our population that we studied. And the horizontal dotted line shows the median time to licensure. And then we see the different colored lines there that go across. And when they intersect at that dotted line, that's about the time when the mean time that licensure occurred for that population group. And so across the bottom, you'll see the number of days, the time to licensure, and what that translates into is for our non-Latino white, it's about 148 days. It's about a little less than half a year is when typically they're getting licensed. For blacks, it was 1,057 days. That's close to 3 years. It's about 2.9 years before they're actually licensed. And for Latino youth, it was 1,263 days. That's 3.5 years of delay before the median time of licensure. So while that, for some might see that difference in time, obviously there's some people would say, and some of our reviewers that looked at our paper when we were being peer-reviewed said, well, if they're not driving, they're safer. They're not behind the wheel. They're not being exposed driving, so you're saving lives. And so I would say absolutely, yes, that's true, unless they're struck by a car as a pedestrian or cyclist. Second thing I would say is that what happens when that youth needs to go back to driving or needs a vehicle at age 21, 22? If you're outside of one of those states that doesn't have extended licensure, you're back to basically step one, learning to drive, learning to get exposed to driving licensure, hopefully you get some graduated exposure, but you may have missed out to some of those safety benefits. So in the conclusion of our study, this particular study, on average, we found that Latino and African American teens obtained a license approximately 3 years after they were legally eligible, and much later than non-Latino whites. Time to licensure likelihood was associated with race and ethnicity and required minimum age of learner permits. We saw more or longer DDL for those teens that were in states that had permits starting at a minimum of 16 years or older. And so that has what we believe have implications for later opportunities that come up just a couple years down the line for these youth for opportunities for health, education, and employment. So there is something to be said about that, but again, more work needs to be done. Two things I want to make clear is that we don't imply in our work here that we're implying that teens should receive their licensure much earlier. As my colleague Dr. Banz said, that we certainly don't believe that. There are a lot more complexity to this. Developmental pieces are really important when you're getting behind the wheel. Driving is quite a complex task. We oftentimes that have been driving for many years don't think about that because there's a lot of automaticity that's set in place for our driving over the years, but it's quite much more complex than most of us remember. We also don't explicitly aim to identify if earlier licensure promotes safe driving outcomes. In fact, we need to better understand what delayed in driving licensure means for those outcomes with crashes, be that injury, property damage, or other types of more serious crashes. But our findings do provide valuable information for the older novice driver GDL discussion, and I think that's what's really important here. We certainly believe that some teens may be aging out of GDL driver safety facets, but we can't be sure, and that needs to be studied further. More detailed examination of factors that contribute to DDL, cultural components, family structure components, these things could certainly examined further could inform interventions focused on safety in more vulnerable youth groups. Future research should certainly intentionally address the individual economic and safety aspect of DDL, as I've mentioned, and what that might mean for adolescents as well as young adult drivers forward in time. So with that, I will close out my piece, and I think we're going to move to questions. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. Vaca. That was so interesting, and the two presentations wove together so perfectly. So we really appreciate both of our speakers for coming in. I'm going to hopefully be able to turn my camera there. I can turn my camera on so you can see me. Hello, everybody, my little dark cave. So we have some questions. We have a lot of questions, and many of the questions we got came in beforehand. So I'm going to start there, but keep putting your questions in the box, the Q&A box, and they'll be fed to me so that we can get to as many questions as possible. So I'll just go ahead and get started. The first question that came in previously was, what role does sleep play in teen driving? Is it addressed in educational setting drivers ed courses? So Dr. Banz, let's go ahead and start with you.
Sure. Yeah, so just like with any outside of teen drivers, sleep is, can have, or being drowsy driving is a major contributor to motor vehicle crashes. And as Dr. Vaca touched upon, drowsy driving is kind of, the GDL programs have focused on reducing drowsy driving among teens by putting time restrictions on when teens can drive, or guidelines on when teens should drive. So reducing late hours of driving and early hours of driving.
Great. Dr. Vaca, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add that just keep in mind that, yeah, we hope that the programs are integrating, you know, the drowsy driving piece and for our teens. And it's really critically important because the neurodevelopmental pieces fall into this. You know, as teens, you know, are staying up later, you know, their brains are changing. They stay up later. They go to sleep in the early mornings, and then they're up at, 6, 7 o'clock trying to get ready for school. I mean, as we know, there's lots of literature out there that has showed to try to change the start times for schools, and some benefits, some evaluations have showed some mixed effects, but this is critically important to be alert and awake, and it's a tough time for the teens. We're asking a lot of them in this time period of learning to drive.
Yeah, that's surely true. Okay, so we're having issues. This is another question that came in before the presentation. The questioner says, we are having issues with getting families to sign up for our classes, either in person or online via WebEx. Do you have any suggestions on the best way to engage this population and or their parents in order to have them commit to learning? Dr. Vaca, you want to take that one first?
Sure. I would say that unfortunately, I don't know what context the question is coming in from. If this is just a driver education, like a private driver's education course. If it is, I think engaging parents at this level is a difficult thing altogether. From a research perspective, it's challenging. And even from an education standpoint, unfortunately, and you'd think that nearly all parents would really want to engage in gathering information, understanding more, having greater clarity in the safety pieces of their teen learning how to drive. Unfortunately, there's a lot of competing factors, and parents maybe are too busy with work. Again, family structure. If there's a single parent in the home, only one vehicle. All these things make it quite difficult. From the perspective of programs that are out there that are driver safety programs for the teens, everything from asynchronous learning opportunities are available. I think that's one opportunity, and what I mean by that is if the parents are to be involved in learning and teaching, sometimes a course that's asynchronous where the parents can access those courses or that information at a different time that may be much easier for them, that certainly is an opportunity. I know there are courses across the country that do that, and that's beneficial. There are some states that it's mandated, for the parents to be there. Our state of Connecticut, we have a mandate of 2 hours at least for the parent to be involved in the driver education. So for my boys now, they're older, they're 25 and 24. I sat for 4 hours, 2 hours and 2 hours for each youth right next to them in this driver education course to learn about safety issues, and that was mandated.
Great, thank you. I have a question, Dr. Banz, that seems really targeting towards you. It's about development. From a developmental perspective, how can we address teens' beliefs that they already know everything and are immortal to increase safe driving practices?
Yeah, that's a big concern that we have with teens and adolescents. It's part of that cognitive imbalance and their exposure. So there's this paradox for our teens that they are the strongest and smartest they've ever been, yet they're at the time of life where they're at the most risk for injury and fatalities due to injuries from motor vehicle crashes. Obviously, we're talking about today, but plenty of other things that they engage in. And there's these high rates of alcohol and marijuana use that we talked about. So one of the important things when working with teens in this prevention realm is that one way that we could probably touch upon this is to continually give teens more information on things that could happen, because they may think to themselves, oh, okay, whenever I get in the car, I always put my phone in the glove box. It's never out. Texting and driving is not going to be a problem for me. However, maybe they have peers in the car and they drive around with a lot of friends and play music loudly. So if we continually give teens more information on and varied information, there'll be hopefully a nugget of information that may stick. That having peers in the car can have a detrimental side effect and things like that, rather than just constantly saying you're at highest risk for being in a motor vehicle crash. We know from some of the prevention literature that being able to create something that's tailored to the person, to the teen in particular, will create longer and more lasting intervention effects and training effects. And so that's one of the things that we focus on with our research in the Drive Sim Lab is figuring out these profiles of drivers in order to create those tailored intervention and training programs.
Great. That sounds great. This one may be a question you both have different perspectives on. So we'll start with Dr. Vaca as a practicing physician. What role could a teen's primary care practitioner play in raising awareness about the importance of safe driver and passenger behavior? What is the best way to encourage these conversations during annual physicals?
Yeah, you know, what's really nice about this is in this area is that like the American Academy of Pediatrics has been involved in this area of injury prevention, traffic safety for decades. They have their own committees that, work on this, work on physician statements, and it's part of what's, put out there for pediatricians, looking at expected developmental points of interest. Teen driver safety or driver licensure is one of those pieces that should typically get addressed. Now, keep in mind that physicians are as they're as busy as ever, if not more so now. But this is something that typically gets and should be addressed. There are other components, as Dr. Banz had already mentioned. It's not just the driving, but it's the driving plus the other exposures. Sometimes, it's friends in the vehicle. Hopefully GDL is playing a piece in that because there are restrictions for the number of passengers in the vehicle, but that varies across the states. There's also exposure to alcohol and drugs. And so while maybe the teen has nobody else in the car, but the teen is now being exposed because new friends at high school, et cetera, and they're exposed to these friends that now maybe are trying alcohol, they're experimenting with other drugs, that becomes quite problematic. So it really is, during those primary care follow-ups, first to get there to those primary care follow-ups, and there's discussions to be had and anticipating. But, as a parent, you can't leave it all to the docs. You've got to have those discussions with your kids. There's really no substitute for that. And on top of that, you're also the one that's modeling behavior that that teen's always looking at. They've been looking at you ever since they were, born. Mm-hmm. So they're watching what you're doing too.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add to that, Dr. Banz?
No, we actually, from my training and my work with my collaborations with Dr. Vaca, I have a very similar opinion, and we have, being able to, in that primary care setting, being able to ask the teen about other things, like Dr. Vaca mentioned, surrounding driving, will really be able to help kind of inform the physician as to what they should be talking about general risk behaviors for the teen that would translate over to driving as well.
Yeah, that's great. We have room. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to go a little out of order, Cindy, to get to this question. And we will do our best to work with our two presenters to answer all the questions offline. But here's one that I find interesting, especially after your presentations about distractions. Can you please comment on any findings related to teen driving vehicles with more safety features like crash avoidance and lane warnings? And I'll just let's start with Dr. Banz on that one.
We can let Dr. Vaca go first because I think that aligns a little bit more with some of his stuff, and I'll follow up.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so, what I'll add here is that, of course, Dr. Banz mentioned about just the occupant space, the driver space being much more complicated, not just for teens, but even older drivers too, so we've got a lot of, the telematics, the infotainment, all these driver assistance systems, advanced driver assistance systems, ADAS, and there is still, a fair amount that we don't know, but many of our colleagues are actually working in this area, trying to see how youth, teens, are interacting with these new technologies, whether it's, lane keeping assist, or changing lanes for alerts, these sorts of things. We believe, at least much of the preliminary information showing that they could be beneficial. However, you have to keep in mind that you're bringing in more information when, gosh, if you really truly ever get a chance to instruct a teen on driving, you will quickly find out how complex it is for them to understand that they're looking out the windshield and at the same time they're seeing the traffic approaching and you're telling them to slow down, and press the brake a little harder, and then before you know it, they're right up on another car, and they just didn't gather that they really have to be continually pressing that brake, so they don't rear end somebody. Now you're bringing in these other, technologies. There is, a lot of room to suggest, and a lot of, preliminary work showing that there is benefit with these new ADAS systems, but we still have to kind of, work this into how that is truly going to reduce overall, crashes, injury crashes, property damage crashes, fatal crashes. And so there's a lot more ongoing work at this point in time. I tend to think that, these advanced systems are quite helpful across the board, but it depends on the context in which they're being used and at what stage from a driver's perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. Thank you to both of you, to our presenters, for just so interesting that I really appreciate both of your presentations, and thank you for taking our questions. We will have a survey go out to all of you. I think a link will be put in whatever you're seeing right now. So with that, we are out of time. Unfortunately, I think I could have gone another couple of hours talking about this. This is such important work.